Today I want to talk about the carburetor that Traxxas uses on the 3.3, the 2.5, and the 2.5R nitro engines. And share what I have found out that works and doesn't work when it comes to these carburetors. But I guess we'll start with, before I loosen the carburetor up on the crankcase, I always make a mark so I know where to set this carburetor back when I go back together with it. But there's a seam that runs down the high-speed needle side of the carburetor, and I'll just put a mark on the crankcase right there where that seam is. And also sometimes, well, when I loosen up the pinch nut, I just turn it probably like two full turns, and if your carburetor doesn't come loose, just tap on that nut a few times, and that'll loosen up the pinch bolt, and then your carburetor should slide out. But one thing you don't want to do is you don't want to start prying on this carburetor, because if you pry on it, you can damage the body of the carburetor real easy. And that's really why I wanted to make this video, to kind of talk about the carburetor, about how, because it's a good carburetor when everything is set up right on it, but you got to take extra care when you're working on it, because the body of the carburetor are real fragile, delicate, and if you mishandle them, you can damage it, and then they're not going to work for you. And Traxxas, they sell a carburetor kit, part number 5247, and it comes with everything you need to reseal the carburetor. It comes with all the O-rings, and it comes with the dust boot for your throttle shaft, and it comes with the steel washers for your high-speed assembly, and it even comes with some tools to help install the O-rings on the needles, and it makes it a whole lot easier with those tools. And it has this little what do you call that? A little scale deal here that you can, that'll help you make sure you get the right O-ring in the right location on your carburetor, because some of these O-rings, they're a little hard to tell apart when you first start working on them. And also, it looks like there's two different style carburetors. One that uses one O-ring and one that uses two O-rings. I've never seen the one that uses just one O-ring. I've always had the ones that took two. That's kind of weird. Not sure what that's about. So I guess I'll start by just taking the carburetor apart, and then when I come to an area where I feel there needs to be some extra care taken, I will explain when I get there. I'm going to go ahead and take the high-speed needle out. And the valve. I call this a valve. It's the seat for the high-speed needle, but I normally call it a valve for some reason. And then you got 2 O-rings and your fuel line nipple. I mean 2 steel washers and your fuel line nipple. And probably the easiest way and the most common way that people can mess one of these carburetors up is by spraying WD-40 in it. And even on the carburetor you can cause major problems there. But if you ever spray WD-40 in it or on the carburetor, you're just going to deal with air leaks after that. Like right here around this, if you get it on this dust boot for the throttle shaft, you'll still get air leaks right here where it attaches to the body. And any O-ring that it makes contact with, you'll have an air leak there. So if you ever put WD-40 in one of these or on one of these, you're going to have to get one of these kits and rebuild the carburetor. And even if you get it on, like, say, the fuel lines, it will soften up the fuel lines and cause them to swell a little bit. And right there where the fuel line goes onto these nipples, they will start leaking right there. And if you get it in your fuel tank, it'll damage that O-ring in your fuel tank. And even if you get it on the exhaust coupler, it will soften that coupler up. When I first got back into the hobby a couple of years ago, I used WD-40 on my Traxxas all the time, and then I found out it was causing 90% of my problems, and I won't even go there anymore. I took it out of the toolbox, and I stay away from it. It's not worth taking a chance. And on these, before you take the throttle arm off, you always want to check and see where it's clocked at. And this one is clocked at about 7 o'clock for the Revo. You just want to make a note of that, so when you go back on with this throttle arm, you can get it back in the location. Because if you don't get it back in the location, when you get it back in the truck, you're going to have a hard time getting your linkage to work right. And on the Revo and the Slayer Pro, you can get to this set screw while it's in the truck. But some of the chassis platforms, you can't get to that set screw, so you're going to have to pull your motor back out pretty much, and so you can get to that set screw to make your adjustment on it. And right here is one of the areas you got to take extra care to when you're disassembling it. What you want to do is, before you take your idle screw out, you need to take the low speed screw out first. Take the low speed screw out before you take the idle screw out. And the reason for that is when you take your idle screw out, your throttle shaft will be able to travel farther inside the body of the carburetor. And if your low speed needle is still inside your throttle shaft, it can damage the inside of the carburetor because it can damage the seat inside the carburetor for your low speed. Then I got to take the spring off, throttle return spring. That's always a fun filler to deal with. And your throttle shaft will not come out until your idle screw is out. I did forget to mention, before you take the hose nipple off, you need to make sure to figure out how you're going to remember to get it in the right position too. But you usually can adjust that while it's in the car with not too much problem. And once you have your idle screw out, your throttle shaft will also come out. And I used to use that rubbing alcohol to clean these parts, but I read somewhere where that rubbing alcohol can damage certain O-rings, so I never experienced any problem with it, but I'm not going to take a chance of it causing any problems. But so I got a spray bottle with Dawn soap and water, and I just spray it with that Dawn soap and water mix, and then I'll get a compressed air and just make sure, dry it off real good and make sure these channels are all clear, or these little passages. But you don't want to be sticking anything down inside the carburetor where the seat is for the low speed. I don't know if you can see that or not, but down inside there is the seat for the low speed, and you don't want to be sticking anything in there and causing any damage to it. And I normally just start by, when I reassemble it, I start with the throttle shaft and the idle screw. And your throttle shaft has a groove that the idle screw has to line up with. And all you do is just line the groove up with your idle screw hole. And just screw it in until the O-ring is fully inside the housing. You don't have to screw it all the way in, just so you can't see the O-ring no more. And that will keep the throttle shaft from sliding out. And your spring, there's a groove up here on the carburetor body that this spring has to sit in. But on your spring, on your bottom coil of your spring, there's a zigzag, in the bottom coil, and you got to get that zig, and his groove has an opening right here on the top side, where on your intake side of the carburetor, there's a little opening in that groove, and you got to get that zigzag inside that groove, and that's where I usually start when I'm assembling that spring. I'll put that zigzag in that groove. Or attempt to. And then work that spring around that bottom coil until it snaps in. Like so. And just make sure that you got the zigzag in that groove, in that opening, like so. If you don't get that zigzag in that little opening, your spring is going to end up popping off. And at this point, I usually go ahead and set the idle gap. The way I do that is I got these tip cleaner set that is used on cutting torches. I bought at Harbor Freight, the Hobart brand, and you want to find the one that is 0.5 millimeters. And that's it, the third one. And that's what you're looking for right there. 0.5 millimeters. Not 5 millimeters, 0.5. Real small, real tiny. 0.5. Set that there. And if you're using something like this, you don't want to damage the carburetor body or the throttle shaft when you're sticking it in there. So just be aware of that. I can see that is already way too small. Perfect, right there. Now it's at 0.5 millimeters. And now you safely can put your low-speed needle back, your low-speed needle back into your throttle shaft, and you don't have to worry about it damaging the inside of your carburetor body or the seat. And I just always set these back to factory settings whenever I'm rebuilding them. And you want to get your low speed needle flush with the top of your throttle shaft. And just make sure this dust boot's not folded anyways, and when you get it in that groove, make sure it's not folded anyways, because you don't want it leaking. It needs to be sealed right there. And just make sure the top one is in its groove too. It usually goes there. And some people, I've heard people ask, well, what is your turns out on your low speed needle? Well, you don't go by turns out on your low speed needle. For one thing, you don't want to be screwing the needle in deeper in the throttle shaft more than you have to, because you can damage the carburetor body. So, and every engine is different. You can have like 10 3.3s, and they're all going to tune different. So really knowing someone else's settings isn't going to do you any good. So just start with the factory settings flushed with the top of the throttle shaft. And also, I think some people may get confused when this arm is on there. They might flush it with the top of this throttle arm, thinking that's the setting. But that's, if you do that, you're going to have a real rich setting when you first start it up. So make sure you get into that, get it flushed to the inside throttle shaft there. And then I know that this one is clocked at 7 hours. So I got that back in the right location. And now we'll install the plugs. And you got two different size plugs with two different size O-rings. And these are the O-rings that you can accidentally put the wrong ones on pretty easy. And this one here always looks like it's loose on there, like it's not the right one, but that's correct, because there's actually like a little recessed in the carburetor body that it fits into. And when I start these plugs, I just use my fingertips, because the threads inside the body of the carburetor are real soft, and they're real easy to cross thread without even realizing you're doing it until it's too late. So, but I've done it before, and I just use my fingertips to get it started. And if I feel any resistance, then I know it's trying to cross thread like that. Well, that usually works. See, it's trying to cross thread. There it goes. Now it's going in. And then I just screw it in with my fingertips until the O-ring touches the body, and then I would just snug it up a little bit. And the same thing with the just snug her down. And on your high-speed needle assembly, first you have a washer. I didn't take a sealing washer. I didn't take it off because it's stuck on there pretty good. But behind that sealing washer is a little step up. And when you put your fuel line nipple onto the valve, your fuel line nipple has two different size holes, a big one and a small one. and the big one will slide over that shoulder really easy, where the small hole will not. It'll go on there if you force it on there like that, but see, it's tight on there, and that's wrong. You want to put the big hole on first, and it's loose on there, and that's the right way. You want it to float. And on these washers, if you look very carefully, one side has like a little bevel to the edges of it, and one side is cut flat. And I always put the bevel side towards the fuel line nipple. So both these washers, the bevel side is going towards the fuel line nipple. Just be careful when you thread these in, because they will strip real easy. And I've done that also. And I know on the Revo, the nipple faces right at the edge of this plug. And just snug it down. Don't over tighten it. And the way you set your high-speed needle assembly back to factory settings is by screwing it all the way down until it bottoms out, and then back it out 4 turns. But you want to be careful when you bottom it out that you don't over tighten it, so you don't damage the seat or the needle. So right when you just barely feel it make just the lightest contact, you stop. Right there, I felt it bottom out, so I'm not going to go anymore. And then what I usually do there is I get me one of these paint markers, and this one has already been painted, but I will make a mark on my high-speed needle, and then I'll make a mark on the valve down here a little bit lower, and that way I kind of keep track of how rich I'm running or how lean it's running, and then I can always go back to the factory settings. And then you want to set your high-speed needle to 4 turns out. And that's 4 right there. And we're out apart. Well, and if you suspect that you have an air leak and you haven't used WD-40, and you know that all your O-rings are in good shape, your fuel line's in good shape, I found out one of the most common places for it to leak is right here on these sealing washers on the high-speed assembly. What you don't want to do is just tighten it. Just keep tightening it, because you're going to end up damaging the threads inside of the body of the carburetor. And what I figured out, and I've done that also, but what I figured out that works is if I suspect I have a leak right there, I'll actually do this on the truck. When I have the truck running, I will loosen this valve up, and then I'll reseat it just and tighten it up again. And then I'll wait a couple of minutes and see if the air leaks gets better or goes away. And if it still acts like it has a little bit of air leak, I will do that again. I will loosen it up and retighten it. And And sometimes you have to do it like 3 or 4 times before that air leak will before it finally seals itself right there. But don't just keep, if you just keep on tightening this and tighten it and tighten it, it'll strip those threads out really easy. I guess that's it. That one's ready to rock and roll right there. And when you go back onto the crankcase, you have 2 O-rings. You have a groove down here on the bottom, and that is your main O-ring to seal the oil from coming out, and to keep the fuel from coming out, and to keep the air from going in. And then you have a O-ring on the top, and that O-ring is basically just like a dirt seal. It keeps the dirt from getting down inside this channel here. Now I do hear about people putting silicone on these, like up here on the top, the silicone, and before they put it in there. But really, silicone isn't going to do any good, because you have your pinch bolt and you got the channel for your pinch bolt, and your pinch bolt is not airtight, so putting silicone on top up here really isn't going to do any good. As long as your O-ring is in good shape, this bottom one, the internal one, if that O-ring is in good shape, you won't have any air leaks right there. But if you do ever see one of the O-rings on the bottom that has been shaved, that's an indication that someone has put in WD-40 in that engine before. Because when WD-40 gets on that O-ring, it swells up, and you go put your carburetor in there, it's going to shave that O-ring. So definitely replace that O-ring, or you'll just have issues there. And then you just line your mark back up that we made previously with the seam on your carburetor, and tighten the pinch bolt. But you got to be real careful when you go back into the car or the truck, whatever you're putting it in. Before you tighten up these engine bolts, make sure you got plenty of clearance around your carburetor, because if it's not clocked just right in the crankcase, it could come in contact with like the upper chassis support or something like that, and then when you tighten these bolts down, you're going to damage the carburetor body. And I've done that also. I got like probably 4 or 5 of these bodies at least that I have messed up over the years, because that's very easy to overlook. I still do that today. I will put them on, and when I start tightening these bolts down, and it's like, why these bolts feel like they're tightening down like they should be, but then it's like, oh, my carburetor's sitting right there. So you got to be real aware of that. And then when you do get it mounted, your engine mounted where it's supposed to be, then you got to go and set your endpoints on your carburetor. You got to make sure that your throttle is opening just the right amount, and you got enough throttle travel so that it closes, that it's able to close all the way. And you don't want your throttle shaft to open any larger than the Ventura. You want it to open the exact size of the Ventura, or a little less is better. But you don't want to go past the size of the Ventura. And then when you hook your, and then you got to make sure that when you push the brakes on your transmitter, that your throttle shaft doesn't have any movement in it. You got to have enough spring pressure on your throttle linkage to be able to keep that firmly closed, because if you have any movement in your throttle shaft when you hit your brakes, you won't be able to set your idle properly. That's one area is overlooked when you set these carburetors up. What else? And also, when I'm doing one of my tuning videos, I'm always talking about adjusting the idle screw and the low speed screw at the same time. And the reason I do that is because whenever you make an idle adjustment, you're moving your throttle shaft, and your low speed needle is in your throttle shaft. So whenever you're making an idle adjustment, you're changing the position of your low speed needle. So you're actually making you're making two adjustments there. So what I do is, once I get my low speed set to where I want it, and that is so that the engine shuts off at 3 seconds when you do the fuel line pinch test. When I have my low speed screw set to where it shuts off at 3 seconds, whenever I make a idle adjustment, I make that same adjustment to my low speed so that I stay at that 3 seconds. If I only make an adjustment, say 3 hours in on my idle screw, that is going to richen my low speed. If I make a 3 hours out on my idle screw, that is going to lean out my low speed adjustment. So the way I get around that is, after I have my low speed set to where it cuts off at 3 seconds, whenever I make, like, say, a 3 hour in adjustment on my idle screw, I'm going to make that same adjustment on my low speed. I'm going to screw my low speed in 3 hours. Whenever I make a 3 hours out on my idle screw, I'm going to turn my low speed screw 3 hours out. So I'm keeping my low speed set. So I'm really not adjusting my low speed. I'm resetting my low speed. Whenever I make an idle adjustment, I'm resetting my low speed to where it was before I made that idle adjustment. You know, it's kind of confusing, but once I understood that, it really made tuning easier, and you feel like you actually know what you're doing. Because before I knew that, I was just like dancing around. I was always lean on the bottom, rich on, either too lean or too rich on the low speed, back and forth. But once I figured that out, it made, it made tuning. I actually feel like I know what I'm doing kind of now, instead of guessing at it. And the way I figured that out is I just got one of these carburetors, and I was just studying it one day, just watching how everything worked. And just not much there, but and then I was looking at it, and it was like, oh wait, each time I turn my idle screw in, it's moving my low speed screw. Well, that's kind of important there. But yeah, that really helped. Knowing that little bit really helped me when I go tune my engines. But you got to learn how to do the the fuel line pinch test correctly. If you don't do it correctly, you're just going to get a false reading, so you won't be setting your low speed right. So you got to learn how to do the test correctly. Well, I guess that's about it. But these carburetors, I mean, they're good carburetors. Once you get them set up right, I don't have any problem with them anymore. When I first got into the hobby, I had, all kinds of problems but the main reason was because I was using WD-40. But as long as you're careful with them as you're working on them, and like don't over tighten, don't cross thread nothing, and just be sure when you messing with that throttle shaft, you don't damage that seat inside the carburetor body. But they work. They work. I'd rather use this than have to spend money on, having to buy a carburetor for every Traxxas I own. I'd rather just use what's on there. But I guess that's about it. That's all I can think of. Yeah, I can't think of anything else until I turn the video off, and then I'll think of it. But yeah, we got some nasty weather anyways. It's not as bad as they thought it was going to be for a day or so. And I got a couple of other videos kind of like this I want to do. See how this one turns out. But like I got my T-Max, I got the transmission in my T-Max. I did something to that transmission that made it, that fixed one of the known problems, a weak point in that transmission, and made it more bulletproof. And I would like to make a video on that, but that means I got to take the transmission out of my T-Max. Do I want to do that? Yeah, I guess ain't too much. It's not too hard to get that out of there. It's not hard to get out. And also, when I used to have a lot of problem with air leaks on these, I found out a good way how to check for air leaks on here, on these engines and your carburetors. I might do a video on that. But I don't ever have an issue with air leaks anymore after doing what I do here. But I might make a video on that, because there's a lot of people I always see people making comments of, well, how do you check for an air leak? And I pretty much perfected that. I got a good technique. So anyways, guys, I guess I'm out of stuff to talk about. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. I forgot to mention something in the video, so I'm gonna come back and just make a quick one. But when you go and mount your carburetor back on the crankcase and line your marks up, this one here don't have the O-ring on it at the moment, but there should be an O-ring underneath here between the crankcase and the carburetor. But when you go tighten your pinch nut up, you want to make sure you have a little bit of down pressure on your carburetor. So you make sure that carburetor is all the way down inside the crankcase and that it's sealing really good against that upper O-ring. And when you have a little bit of pressure on it, go ahead and tighten that nut up on your pinch bolt. But that's all I wanted to add to that. So later, guys.